Today, we're diving into a fascinating world where ancient faith meets modern finance. We're talking about a multi-trillion-dollar industry called Sharia-Compliant Finance. And what's so incredible is how these deeply held values can completely reshape everything from a company's balance sheet to how the entire global market weathers a storm. But let me start by asking you a question, and be honest with yourself. Would you be willing to make less money? Maybe, if it meant that every single one of your investments was perfectly aligned with your personal, ethical, or religious beliefs. This isn't just a thought experiment. It is the fundamental question at the heart of the entire industry we're about to unpack. You know, in finance, there's actually a name for this. It's called the faith premium. It's this idea that for a lot of people, the real return on an investment isn't just about dollars and cents. It's about the peace of mind that comes from sticking to your principles. And that idea right there is the bedrock of Sharia-compliant finance. All right, so how does this whole finance with faith thing actually work in practice? Well, to really get a handle on its performance, its strengths, and all its little quirks, we first have to understand the rules of the game. So, what are these rules? Because we're not talking about minor tweaks here. These rules fundamentally change the DNA of how money works, creating a completely different kind of financial ecosystem. The biggest difference, the one that changes everything, really just boils down to one word: risk. See, conventional finance is all about interest. A lender gives you money, and they get their interest payment no matter what. The risk is all on you, the borrower. But Sharia-compliant finance is built on risk sharing. It's a partnership. If the venture makes a profit, everyone shares it. But, and this is the crucial part, if it takes a loss, everyone shares that too. You're in it together. And that single principle creates this ripple effect that defines how these companies behave. Because they generally avoid interest-based debt, they naturally operate with lower leverage. They have a strict no-fly zone for certain industries, like alcohol or gambling. What you end up with is a company that's just more conservative, more cautious, and really prefers to use its own cash instead of borrowing from the outside. So this begs a really interesting question, right? If the number one goal isn't just to maximize profit at all costs, then how do you even keep score? What does a win look like in this system? Well, first things first, all the familiar metrics are absolutely in play. Don't think for a second this isn't serious business. Investors are crunching all the usual numbers: return on assets, return on equity, you name it. They're even using sophisticated tools like the Sharpe and Trainer ratios to measure how much return they're getting for the amount of risk they're taking. So yeah, this world is very much grounded in hard data. But that's just scratching the surface. If that were the whole story, this would be just another niche investment strategy. There's a whole other layer to how success is defined here. And that other layer is a concept called Maqasid al-Sharia. The easiest way to think about it is like a second parallel scorecard. It goes beyond the financials and asks bigger questions. Is this business actually making society better? Is it promoting fairness? Is it good for the community? This is where the ethics get graded, formally. So with that dual scorecard in mind, let's put these two systems head to head and look at the data. And what you find is this really fascinating, kind of complex performance puzzle. There's no easy answer. On the one hand, you see some clear examples of outperformance. I mean, look at Indonesia. Studies found that Sharia-compliant firms there actually had higher performance even though they had less debt. Or check out Pakistan, where their mutual funds delivered better returns when you account for risk. The evidence for success is definitely there. But then, just when you think you've got it figured out, the picture completely flips. For example, their IPOs often underperform the market over the long term. They can be more vulnerable to shocks in things like oil prices. And here's a really strange one. In some parts of the world, the more these companies talk about their ethical standards, the worse their profitability gets. It's a real head-scratcher. So the big takeaway here is that, well, it's complicated. You compare Islamic and conventional banks, no real statistical difference in returns. You look at stock indexes in India, they don't really outperform, but, and this is huge, they provide a much more stable ride during a crisis. And here's the most fascinating bit of nuance. On paper, their accounting books often look stronger, but the stock market, it just doesn't always reward them for it. There's a real disconnect there. And if you want one number that kind of captures their whole personality, this is it. This figure represents how quickly these companies adjust their finances to get to their ideal state. And that speed, somewhere between roughly 40 and 44%, is considered very measured. It's not slow, but it's deliberate. It's the perfect reflection of that cautious, risk-averse approach we've been talking about. All of this leads us to our final and maybe most important section. All these rules, all these performance numbers, they were all put through the ultimate real-world stress test just a few years ago. So the big question is, how did this model hold up during a global pandemic?
Well, the key finding is pretty powerful. This quote from the research really says it all. Their profitability decline was significantly less severe. In other words, the very things that can sometimes make them look a little boring in a booming economy, the low debt, the careful policies, that became their absolute superpower when the world was in crisis.
So what we learned from this giant, unplanned global experiment is a clear profile of resilience. Being conservative with low leverage just means you're less fragile when a shock hits. Being risk-averse means your whole game plan is built around stability, not just growth. And being cash-reliant, which is a direct result of avoiding interest, turned out to be a massive advantage. It let them weather the storm without having to go out and find expensive help. And this leaves us with one last, really big thought. We started this by asking if you trade financial returns for your values. But what the pandemic showed us raises a much, much bigger question. What if it's not a trade-off at all? What if those very values, sharing risk, keeping debt low, focusing on the real economy, what if they aren't just an ethical choice? Could they actually be a blueprint for a more stable, more resilient global financial system for every single one of us?